The ice on the river had not yet broken when she arrived in Carlo Creek, and the town looked like it had been waiting all winter for something that had not come. She was not that something. She knew that much before she stepped off the coach. The driver handed down her bag without ceremony and climbed back to his seat before the dust had settled around her boots. She stood on the frozen ground and looked at the main street. A hardware store, post office with a crooked sign, a feed merchant with his door propped open against all reason given the temperature. At the far end, past a stand of bare poplar, a carpentry shop with smoke coming from its chimney, and the sound of a hand plane moving in long, even strokes, unhurried and precise. She had a letter in the inside pocket of her coat. She had read it enough times that she could have recited it from memory, though she had not. The man who wrote it had placed a notice in the Winnipeg paper in late November. He was looking for a woman to manage his household. He had a daughter, 5 years old, in need of looking after. The wage was adequate and a room was included. He had written that he was not in a position to offer more than the work and asked that anyone who replied understand that plainly. She had understood it plainly. She had written back the same day. There was a woman standing in front of the post office watching her, not unfriendly, just watching, the way people in small towns watched things arrive. The woman had a parcel under one arm and no particular hurry about her. She nodded once when their eyes met. Her name, as it turned out, was Greta Finch, though this came later. At the moment, she was simply a woman with a parcel and an even gaze, and that was enough. She picked up her bag and walked toward the carpentry shop. The sound of the plane stopped before she reached the door. He was standing at the entrance when she got there, as if he had heard her coming across the frozen ground. He was taller than she had imagined from the letter, though she could not have said what she had imagined. His hands hung at his sides, large and unhurried. He was wearing a canvas apron dusted pale with fine shavings, and there was sawdust in his hair above his left ear that he did not seem aware of. She looked at him. "You came on the morning coach," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes," she said. He held the door. She went in. The shop was warm. That was the first thing. Not the aggressive warmth of a stove pushed too hard, but the steady, accumulated warmth of a room that had been heated consistently for years. Wood shavings covered the floor in pale curls. A half-finished cabinet stood against the far wall, its doors not yet hung. The smell was clean in the way that only certain things are clean. Cedar, linseed oil, cold air that had come through a crack somewhere and been slowly absorbed into the warmth. Child was sitting on an overturned crate near the back wall. She had her father's dark hair cut straight across her forehead, and she was pressing her thumbnail into a small block of scrap wood with the focused gravity of a person conducting a serious experiment. She did not look up when they came in. "Hazel," he said, not loudly. The girl looked up. She examined the woman with the direct and uncomplicated attention of a young child, assessing her without embarrassment and without warmth. "This is the woman who's come to help us," he said. Hazel considered this. She pressed her thumbnail into the wood one more time. Then she went back to what she had been doing. He did not apologize for this. She was glad he didn't. "The house is through the yard," he said. "I'll show you when I've put the plane away." She nodded and waited. He moved through the shop without fuss, setting tools back in their places with the ease of someone who had never had to think about where anything belonged. The plane went on a bracket beside two others, oldest to newest, the way she had lined up her mother's spice jars once, years ago, an ordering principle that made sense only to the person who had established it. Outside, the yard between the shop and the house was hard-packed earth, snow compressed into ice by the weight of months. A woodpile stood against the east wall of the house, substantial, carefully split and stacked in alternating directions to let the air through. She noticed it the way she noticed the thing that told her most about a person. He had not left the winter wood to chance. The house was 2 stories, white paint gone to gray, a covered porch with a split in the railing someone had attempted to fix with a length of wire that had not held. One window on the upper floor had the curtain drawn, the rest did not. He held the porch door. She went ahead of him into the kitchen. The kitchen was large, larger than she expected. A cast iron stove against the north wall, cold at this hour, the morning fire having burned down. table with 4 chairs, one of which had a child's cushion tied to the seat, shelves on the east wall with canning jars, many of them empty. A wash basin on a stand beside the window that looked into the yard. She set her bag down and stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. "The stove runs warm on the right side," he said from behind her. "If you bake, keep that in mind." She turned around. He was standing near the door with his hands in his apron pockets, watching her take in the room with a kind of deliberate neutrality, neither apologizing for it nor presenting it. "Is there bread flour?" she said. He moved to the pantry at the far end of the kitchen and opened the door. She followed and looked: salt, a tin of baking powder, dried beans, some salt pork, a jar of preserved plums. Not abundance, but order. Everything labeled in the same hand. "Who labeled these?" she said. Without meaning to ask it out loud, there was a pause. "My wife," he said. "I haven't moved them." She looked at the jars. The handwriting was careful and even. She closed the pantry door. "I'll need a few things from the feed merchant," she said. "Eggs, if he has them." "He does," he said. "I'll take you this afternoon if you'd like to go, or you can go alone. Either suits me." She looked at him. He was not offering to escort her so much as he was indicating that the town was hers to navigate however she chose. She found that she appreciated the distinction. "This afternoon," she said. He nodded and went back to the shop. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. She could hear the plane start up again across the yard, that long, even stroke, then a pause, then again. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, beside a smaller coat of pale blue wool, child-sized, with one button missing at the collar. She opened the stove, found the last of the coals still holding a faint heat at the center, and began to build the fire back up from there. Hazel came in from the shop some time later, without announcement. She climbed into her chair at the table and sat with her hands folded in her lap in a manner that seemed borrowed from an adult, some instruction she was working to remember. She watched the woman at the stove. "What are you making?" the girl said. "Porridge, for now," the woman said. "Something better later." Hazel seemed to weigh this. "Papa makes porridge," she said. "He doesn't put anything in it." "What would you put in it?" Hazel thought. "Jam," she said, "and butter at the same time. That's not the worst idea I've heard." The girl did not smile, but something in her face shifted, the way a door that has been stiff against its frame will settle just slightly when the temperature changes. She turned to look at the window. "It's going to snow again," she said. The sky above the poplar was the color of pewter, flat and low. "Probably," she said. That was how the first morning passed. Not in declaration or arrangement. In porridge and firewood and a child who pressed her thumbnail into things and watched the sky for weather. He came in at midday. He looked at the pot on the stove and then at the table, which had been wiped down and set with 2 plates and 1 smaller one. He sat down without being asked to. Hazel came in behind him and climbed into her chair. They ate without much conversation. She had made a soup from the salt pork and the dried beans and some dried onion she had found at the back of the pantry shelf. And it was not remarkable, but it was warm and it was enough. He ate steadily and without comment. Hazel ate about half of hers and then asked if she could get down. And he said yes, and she did. When the girl had gone back to the shop, he poured himself a second cup of the coffee she had made and sat with it, held in both hands. He did not drink it immediately. "The room," he said, "is up the stairs, first door. It was used for storage. I cleared it last week. There's a cot and a lamp. I can get a blanket from the chest if it's cold. I'll let you know," she said. He nodded. "Hazel," he said, and then did not continue for a moment. "She doesn't talk much." "Not since," he stopped. "She used to talk more." She looked at him across the table. He was looking at the cup. "She told me about the porridge," the woman said. Something crossed his face, small and quick, and then gone. He took a drink of his coffee. "She's particular about the porridge," he said. "Most people are," she said, "when someone asks." He looked at her then, briefly, and then back at the cup. He stood up a few minutes later and rinsed his cup at the basin and went back out to the shop without hurry. She cleared the table and listened to the plain resume across the yard. The afternoon was clear and cold. She walked with him to the feed merchant and stood at the counter and indicated what she needed. He stood a little back, not directing, not hovering. The man behind the counter, a slow-moving older man with a red nose and a methodical way of measuring, glanced between them once with the practiced and uninquisitive expression of someone who had long since decided that other people's arrangements were not his business. She paid for the eggs herself from the wages he had given her that morning without being asked. He had counted out the money and set it on the table beside her cup as he passed and said nothing about it, and she had put it in her coat pocket and said nothing about it either. On the way back, she stopped outside the dry goods store. A bolt of oilcloth in the window, deep green, the kind you could line a pantry shelf with. "Is there oilcloth in the kitchen?" she said. "No," he said. She went in. He waited outside. She was not sure if this was courtesy or indifference. She looked at the oilcloth and also at a roll of flannel in a dark red that she looked at for somewhat longer before setting it back. She bought 2 yards of the oilcloth and thanked the woman behind the counter, who was young and had the bright, curious expression of a person who very much wanted to ask something and was managing not to. Outside, he took the package from her without asking and carried it back to the house. In the kitchen, she measured the pantry shelves and cut the oilcloth to fit. He came in once to get something and saw what she was doing and looked at it, and then left again. She heard him in the shop for another hour after that, the plane, then a saw, then the particular sound of a mallet tapping something into place, careful and repetitive. She put Hazel to bed that evening. The girl had been fed and bathed. She bathed herself with the systematic independence of a child who had been doing it alone for some time, and she lay under her quilt with her hands flat at her sides. "Will you be here in the morning?" Hazel said. "Yes," she said. Hazel considered this. "Papa said you'd be here. He says things will happen and then they do." "That's good to know," she said. She left the lamp turned low on the table by the door and went downstairs. He was in the kitchen at the table. He had the stove going strong and a mug in front of him. There was another mug set on the far side of the table, she noticed, steam still rising from it. She had not heard him come in, had not known he was there, and yet there was a second cup. She sat down across from him. She thought about what Hazel had said. He says things will happen, and then they do. She looked at the second cup, set without ceremony, set without comment, set simply in the way that a thing is set when the person who sets it sees no particular reason to announce it. She took the cup. The tea was not sweet. She did not ask for anything to make it so. They sat for some time. Outside, the temperature had dropped further. She could hear it in the silence, the particular quality of cold that a prairie night carried, dense and without apology. He said, "Hazel hasn't slept through in about 4 months." She said nothing and let him have the silence to continue if he chose. "She wakes up around 2, he said. "She doesn't call out. She just, I hear her. I usually sit with her for a bit." He turned his cup on the table. "I thought you should know in case you hear it." "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded and looked at the stove. She thought about the empty canning jars on the shelf, the labeled ones at the back of the pantry that he had not moved, the child's coat on the hook with the missing button. She thought about a woman who had written even careful letters on jars of preserved plums and had not stayed long enough to use them all. She did not ask. It was not her question to ask. Not yet, and possibly not ever. And either way, she understood that some things in a house were like the boards in a floor. You learned their position by feel, by living over them, and you did not need to name them to know where they were. She finished her tea. "The pantry shelves are lined," she said. "The oilcloth should keep the moisture from getting into the flour." "Good," he said. She rinsed her cup and set it in the basin. She went upstairs. The room he had prepared was clean and sparse. A cot with a wool blanket, a lamp, a hook on the back of the door, a window that looked out over the yard and the shop beyond it, dark now, snow beginning to sift down again, light and without wind. She sat on the edge of the cot for a moment. Below her, she heard the scrape of his chair being pushed back, his footsteps measured across the kitchen floor, the stove being damped for the night, the quiet that followed. She lay down without undressing. She was cold at first, and then she was not. The weeks arranged themselves into a pattern. She was up before him. Not by much. She could hear his boots on the stairs by the time she had the stove lit. But enough. She made the coffee and left a cup on the counter, and he took it without comment. Hazel came down 20 minutes after him, always wearing one sock higher than the other, for reasons she had never explained and apparently did not feel required to. She cooked. She mended. She learned which floorboard announced itself when Hazel crept down at night, and she learned to count the child's footsteps without getting up. More often than not, by the time she thought to rise, she could hear the low register of his voice already, too quiet to make out words, and Hazel going still in the way that children go still when they have found the thing they needed. She watched him the way she had always watched the people she worked for, not with judgment, but with the kind of attention that came from needing to understand a place. He was unhurried in everything. He did not raise his voice. He said what he meant with an economy of words that had nothing to do with coldness and everything to do with the conviction that extra words did not improve a thing. He was kind to Hazel in the way a person is kind when it does not occur to them to be anything else. He was not unkind to her either, but there was a boundary in the house that she could feel without being able to see it. The way you feel the edge of a property in open land, not by fence but by something more inherent, a change in the quality of the ground underfoot, a shift in how the wind came off the trees. She was inside the house. The shop was his. She did not cross to the shop except to call Hazel in for meals, or to let him know when something was needed. And when she did not linger. She stood at the threshold and said what she had come to say and went back across the yard. He would look up from his work and listen and nod, and that was the end of it. One morning she needed a board to replace a shelf bracket that had pulled loose in the back kitchen. She had looked at it for 2 days without saying anything, and then, because it annoyed her, and she was not a person who sat with things that could be fixed, she walked across the yard and said so. He was fitting a joint on something that would eventually be a chest of some kind. She could not yet see the shape of it. He looked up. "How long?" he said. "About this," she said, and held her hands apart. "What thickness?" she thought. "The others are about that thick," and she held 2 fingers together. He turned back to his bench, found a piece and cut it without measuring, which meant he had already known what size it would need to be. He handed it to her. "There are small nails in the tin on the windowsill," he said. "In the kitchen, on the second shelf." "I know," she said. "I found them last week." He looked at her then, briefly, with the same measuring quality he had had the first day at the door, but something in it was different, less arriving at a conclusion and more confirming one. She took the board and went back to the house. She fixed the bracket herself while Hazel watched from the doorway and handed her nails one at a time with the seriousness of a surgical assistant. "You're good at that," Hazel said. "I've done it before," she said. "Papa does it too," Hazel said. "But you didn't ask him to." She drove the last nail flush. "No," she said. "I didn't." Hazel turned this over. "He fixes things before I know they're broken," she said, with the tone of someone who has observed this long enough to understand it as a fact of the world. She set the hammer down and looked at the shelf. Straight, solid. She put the tin of nails back on the second shelf where she had found them. "Does he?" "Yes," Hazel said. "He fixed the step before I fell on it." "That was thoughtful of him," she said. "I fell on it anyway," Hazel said, without particular rancor. After, she bit the inside of her cheek to keep her face straight and went to put the kettle on. Spring came late that year, the way it always did in that part of the country, arriving not in warmth, but in the particular quality of thaw, the sound of water moving under ice at the edge of the river, the poplar trees going faintly gold-green at the branch tips before you could call it any color at all. She noticed it from the kitchen window one morning and stood for a moment with her coffee held two-handed and watched the light on the yard. It was different than winter light, lower, somehow, and more forthcoming. He had been quiet that week. Not in any way that could be pointed to, not louder or shorter than usual, just interior. The kind of quiet that belonged to a person thinking something through. She recognized it because she was a person who thought things through the same way, without advertising it. She did not ask. She let the week be what it was. On the Thursday, she came back from the post office to find something on the kitchen table, a small folded piece of brown paper set in the middle of the surface where she would see it when she came in, not wrapped, not tied. Just folded over itself once. She set her coat on the hook. At it, inside was a card of buttons. 6 buttons, the same size and shape as the one missing from Hazel's blue wool coat. Not the same color as the others. A deeper shade of blue. Clearly not a match, but the right size from someone who had looked at what was needed and found the closest available thing. She stood there for a moment. The shop was quiet. He had gone to the mill that morning, he had told her at breakfast, and would be back by supper. There was no one to look at, no expression to read. Just the buttons in her hand and the sound of the water moving at the edge of the frozen river 2 streets over. And Hazel, somewhere upstairs talking to something, a doll or herself, or the particular interior companion that 5-year-olds carry with them. She set the buttons down. She went to the sewing basket on the shelf and found her small scissors and a needle and the right weight of thread and sat down at the table. She unpinned the missing button from the inside of Hazel's coat lapel, where she had found it weeks ago and kept it in case the right moment came, and she held it next to the new ones. Not the same. Close enough that a child would not notice, and a tired man certainly would not, and in a year would not matter at all. She sewed on all the buttons, taking the old ones off first, and replaced the whole set with the new ones so the coat would be even. Took her the better part of an hour. She was not hurried about it. When he came back at supper time, stamping his boots on the porch, she had the coat hanging on Hazel's hook by the door. He did not say anything about it. He came in and washed his hands and helped Hazel with her chair and sat down. She put the food on the table and sat across from him. Hazel looked at her coat on the hook. "My buttons are different," Hazel said. "They are," she said. "Do you mind?" Hazel considered. "They're darker," she said, "like the river when it gets deep." "Yes," she said. "I like them," Hazel said, and picked up her fork. He said nothing, but when he passed her the bread a moment later, his hand was not quite as quick about it as usual. It lingered a moment in the space between them, the way a hand does when a person is deciding whether to say something and decides instead to say nothing, and the nothing is not empty. She took the bread. She looked down at her plate and did not look up for a moment, and when she did, he was looking at Hazel, who was conducting a small architectural experiment with her carrots. That evening she stayed in the kitchen after Hazel had gone up. It had become a habit she had not planned on forming. He came in from checking the yard and poured himself water at the basin and sat down. She was mending a pair of work trousers someone had left on the porch, though she did not know whose they were or when they had appeared. She had found this happened in small towns. Things arrived at the houses of people known to be useful. He turned his glass on the table. "She used to ask," he said, "every night." When her mother was coming back, she set her needle in the cloth without looking up. "She stopped asking about 2 months ago," he said. "I don't know if that's better." She looked up then. He was looking at the table, not at her. His hands were flat on the surface, the same way hers had been that first night. "It might be both," she said. He was quiet. She went back to the mending. "She likes you," he said finally, in the tone of a man who is not saying only what he is saying. "I like her," she said. The fire ticked in the stove. The last of the ice at the river would go in another week, probably less. She could hear it in the air now when the wind shifted right, the specific held-breath quality of a landscape about to change. He said, "There's a fair in Millport in May, about an hour north. Hazel's been asking about it." She set the trousers down and looked at him. He was looking at the glass. The corner of his jaw had a quality she had seen before, a careful setting, the expression of a person who has decided to say a thing and is not yet certain how it will land. "I thought," he said, "if you were still here, if it suited you." She looked at him for a moment. He did not look up. "May is some time away," she said. He said, It is." She picked the mending back up. Neither of them said anything further for some time. The wind came through the eaves and the fire settled, and the town went on about the business of a late winter evening, unhurried and familiar and entirely indifferent to what was happening in this kitchen. She set the last stitch and clipped the thread and folded the trousers over the back of the chair. The stove needed banking. She rose to do it and found he had already risen and was already doing it, and they stood on either side of the stove for a moment, neither one having meant to arrive there at the same time. Close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his arm, and he could see, if he looked, the small scar on her right hand that she had stopped noticing 20 years ago. He stepped back first. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She went upstairs. Through the window in the upper hall she could see the yard and the shop and the poplar trees, and the sky above them, going from black to the particular blue that comes just before the last dark lifts. She stood at that window for a moment. She had done it before, she realized. It was something that had become a habit without her marking the moment it formed. Below, the kitchen light went out. She heard his footsteps cross to the other room, the sound of the house settling in the cold. She went to bed. She did not count the days until May. She had not said she would go. She had not said she wouldn't. She had said what was true, which was that May was away. And it was. And between now and then there was the rest of the thaw and the mud season, and the first planting and the sound of the river letting go and all the ordinary work of all the days between. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the ceiling. The spool of dark thread she had used for the buttons was on the table by the basin. She had not put it away. She looked at it in the dim, just visible in the stripe of cold light that came under the curtain. She had not been chosen carelessly. She understood that in the way you understand things that settle into the body rather than the mind, not as a thought but as a shift in weight, a rebalancing. The way a door that has been hanging wrong for years will sometimes, for no reason you can name, finally settle in its frame and close without resistance. She turned on her side. She listened to the house. She was still listening when sleep came for her, and the sound she fell asleep to was the sound of the river, 2 streets over, moving in the dark under its loosening ice, not loudly, not urgently, just working its way toward what it was always going to become.